So good morning, everybody. At the science seminar on occupational exposure limits for substances toxic to reproduction and findings from PARC. Today we have Linda Schenk with us. So as a little sort of update for those of you who have not followed any previous science seminars, we set this up to exchange between ECHA experts and scientists from outside ECHA on human health and environmental topics that could be relevant to ECHA's regulatory activities. Really with the aim to discuss science and find out more about its regulatory relevance and how we can potentially uptake these results into our daily work. We will publish these science seminars on ECHA Science website under the Knowledge Hub, where you can already find some more science seminars that were presented before. So on today's science seminar, the topics is on occupational exposure limits for substances toxic to reproduction, and then in particular, whether these are sufficiently protective for these type of effects. And that's where Linda looked into in detail. She is a principal researcher from the Karolinska Institute in the Institute of Environmental Medicine with a focus on occupational toxicology and methodological research on risk assessment and the derivation of exposure guidelines. She's also an expert in occupational exposure limit derivation and a member of the Nordic expert group that works on this topic. Current projects that she's working on is the understanding and use of occupational exposure limits, uptake and effects due to skin exposure, and the use of cleaning agents and the risks related to that. The work that she will present today is also published, and the link to the article in PubMed you find at the bottom of this slide. So with this, Linda, I would like to give you the floor. I think if you share your presentation, it will come up on the screen.
Thank you very much, Fleur. So now my computer tells me I am sharing.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Excellent. So I have a lot to cover with you today, so I'll jump right into it. I'm going to give you a background to the case study, some results on coverage and scientific basis. I'm going to go through what that means shortly before I move on to some of my thoughts on prioritizing for future OEL setting. I also want to acknowledge that I haven't done this work alone. I've had support. There are 3 master students that have done their thesis work under the umbrella of this case study, and also several PARC partners that have contributed substantially. But if we move to pre-PARC, my initial motivation for this case study comes from a general thought that has been circulating in my head that well workers are considered a less sensitive and less variable population than the general population. But this is a bit in contrast to that the age as that we are workers during is also generally the age when we become parents. And the developing fetus, which would then be inside the body of a worker, is part of the sensitive or the most sensitive subpopulation, is a general statement. And we actually do have a separate piece of legislation to add a layer of protection for pregnant and lactating workers to protect specifically from developmental toxicity. But my opinion is that this risks being insufficient. For instance, because we can be pregnant without knowing it for quite a while, and we might have reasons to not disclose the pregnancy during the early stages to our employer, and then all extra risk management efforts will be difficult to implement for the employer if they don't know their employee needs it. So yeah, my question was, is developmental toxicity given sufficient attention in OEL setting? Because my opinion is that OELs should protect everyone in the working population. But this was a couple of years before PARC was defined. But then as we were in the application stage, I was asked to contribute to task 6.3 of PARC. And then there were other factors to consider as well when I wanted to bring up this particular case study. So for instance, there was this decision to include reproductive toxicants in the carcinogens and mutagens directive. So now it is CMRD. So we decided to not limit ourselves to developmental toxicity, but also include all reproductive toxicants in the PARC case study. And also, I've been doing some work on REACH DNALs, specifically registrants DNALs for workers' long-term inhalation exposure, because they look similar to OELs. And by looking similar, I mean that they are airborne concentrations, and some safety data sheets list the worker DNALs in the same section as OELs. So worker DNALs are not OELs, they're not implemented in the same way or meant to be the same tool, but I did have some indications from my research that workplaces may mix DNALs and OELs up. And I also had some concerns regarding reliability of certain registrants worker DNALs. So I wanted to include a comparison to REACH DNALs as well. So the research question of the PARC case study was, what protection does the work environment legislation offer towards reproductive and developmental toxicity through occupational exposure limits? And how does it compare to worker DNALs under REACH? There are some delimitations on how you can study these questions. So we decided to start from a set of substances that are known to be toxic to reproduction. So harmonized classification, 1A or 1B for reprotoxicants. And that at the time when we started was a list of 183 substances if we did not count metal compounds more than once. So there are a bunch of nickel compounds on the list, but counting it nickel only once, it would be 183. And we did that because we often set OELs for metal and metal compounds as one OEL, but then covering the whole group. Across the PARC partners in this case study, we covered lists from of OELs from, of course, the European Union, but also 9 countries or organizations across Europe. And we also covered worker DNAs from registrants, as well as the ones that have been issued by ECHA RAC. But then what is protection through an exposure limit? Well, a first stage is that a substance has an OEL or a worker DNAL, so substance coverage. A second level would be what is the allowed air concentration, or what is the dose response that it's based on? So the level of the OEL for worker DNAL. And the absolutely most important factor would be implementation, and that workplaces actually adhere to the limit, I would say. But that was outside of the scope of this case study, so we haven't covered that. We only cover substance coverage and a little bit about the scientific basis behind the OELs and worker DNALs covered by us. So jumping into coverage, that is the share of the substances with this harmonized classification that are covered by different lists of OELs or DNALs. And the coverage ranged from 2 to 40%. Again, this is excluding multiples of metal compounds. And in the table to the left, you see the number of OELs by certain sources. And the largest share of substances is perhaps not surprisingly covered by registrants' worker DNLs. The figure to the right shows the cumulative coverage, showing that we have a quite large share of substances that are not covered at all, to 0. And then it's quite few substances that are covered by all 12 of our sources, because we have a not very steep slope towards the end of this cumulative curve. But digging into the scientific basis of OELs and DNLs, it is of course also important to know what are the aims when setting these values. What is the policy underlying the process regarding reproductive and developmental toxicity? So we started by looking at either the derivation methodology document from these different sources, or if that was not available, the description of the occupational exposure limit in the list of OELs or associated regulation, to extract a description of what is the aim regarding specifically reprotox. And the aims, they ranged from having like empirical caveats, such as cannot be assumed to be adequate for protecting pregnant or breastfeeding workers, to more generic aims that we should protect workers' health without specifically mentioning different endpoints covered, to having these explicit mentions of the target population, including workers' offspring, or that also reproductive toxicity data should be considered in the setting of the limit. But all in all, variable aims, one can say, but none excluded reproductive or developmental toxicity specifically. So then we moved on to looking at the levels of OELs. And in this particular figure, we compare the different lists of DNLs and OELs to the REACH registrant worker DNLs. That's because they cover the largest span. So it gave us the most potential for ratios. And because we also were specifically interested in comparing towards this alternative source of exposure guidance values. What we see is that is a huge range, large variability, and we can't say that registrant worker DNLs are consistently higher or lower. The most common value of the ratio is 1, and that means that the worker DNL and the list that is given here on the y-axis has the same value for the specific substance. Each ring represents one substance. And rings to the left mean that the registrant's DNL is higher, and rings to the right mean that it is lower. But we are also interested in the variability just across occupational exposure limits. I can't show you 11 of these figures that I have to the right, but I made a summary of the maximum to minimum ratio of each substance. And as you see here, if we include the worker DNLs, which is the darker bars, we have a larger share towards the higher ratios, more variability. And if we exclude them, we then have the largest share actually being an equal value across the different lists. So there's somewhat less variation OEL to OEL, but it is not no variation across different sources of OELs. I want to be clear about that. We also looked into the critical effect of these different exposure limits. For these selected lists in our study, we could retrieve and read 220 documentations or scientific bases. 72 of these were for registrant worker DNLs, and for other sources, we had 3 to 41 documents. And across these documents, The share of limits that had repro as the critical effect or the leading effect ranged from 6 to 82%. 82% was for RAC workadenals. So repro is a strong factor in prioritizing substances for those processes. And the 6% was actually for Sweden, my country. And we could only retrieve 16 appropriate documents here. And only one of those 16 had repro as a critical effect. So the share of documents that have repro as a critical effect is dependent both on different substances being covered by the different lists that we investigated, but actually also different conclusions for the same substance. And across our examples, there was actually only one substance with more than 3 assessments that we could study. And all of those had repro as a critical and leading effect, and that was the DEHP of phthalate. A surprising finding, to me at least, was that on average across these examples, OELs and workadenas based on repro are somewhat higher than OELs and DNLs based on other effects. We are still in the realm of substances that are classified as repro 1A or 1B, though. And specifically for, let's say, EU sources of exposure guidance values, so EU OELs, RAC recommendations, and various workadenals, we looked into the safety margin between the OEL and the critical effect. That is basically the assessment factor, and the safety margin from the OEL to the lowest cited repro potential point of departure. And in 85% of cases, the safety margin was equal or larger for repro effects than for the critical effect. That is based on an internal consistency, so it is dependent on the data cited by each document. But in summary, it looks like reproductive and developmental toxicity is often not judged as the critical or leading effect because it occurs at higher doses than other types of effects, even for substances classified as reproductive toxicants 1A or 1B. So, what are my thoughts then on prioritizing substances for occupational exposure limits? I'm thinking that having a registrant's workadenal is an interesting factor because registration obligations are connected to marketing of substances. So for us, it was a simple way of ascertaining that a substance is used on the European market. Since it seems that reprotox may not be the critical or leading effect for many substances, we decided to use reprotox as the leading effect for the registrant's workadenals as a kind of sentinel for specific concern for repro. But we have to acknowledge that an OEL expert group may not have the same judgment. So if these substances would go through an OEL process, they may not be judged to have repro as the critical effect, but it is a kind of indicator we could use for concern. And then higher tonnage, because it is a potential indicator of more workers being involved and exposed. Even though it's far from a perfect indicator, we would want to have more detailed data on actual uses and actual exposures, of course. Using these criteria, we did get a list of a little bit more than 30 substances, but this was a couple of years ago, so we know there have been new developments in OELs since our survey. In particular, there has been way many more recommendations from ECHA. So I decided to do an updated data search. So I checked for additional OELs in the Justice International Limit Value database. And I also added recent ECHA recommendations. And what I ended up with there was 12 substances that have a registrant's work adenal that is based on developmental or reproductive toxicity, plus lacking any OEL in the Justice ILV database. I also sorted out 21 substances that lack an EU OEL or ECHA recommendation, plus were in the more than 1,000 ton band. And the tonnage bands are from May 23, so they're not the most recent ones, fortunately. But across these lists, A and B, there are 27 unique substances that I will show you in the next slide. But we can also look at the classifications of these or the hazard phrases associated to them. And we see that almost all of these 27 are classified as may damage development, and about half may damage fertility. And you see there's also quite a lot of overlap in the Venn diagram to the right. And we have a few that are classified as a bit milder, as suspected damaging fertility or suspected damaging development. That's the small d to the left. It's one substance. So the 27 substances, unfortunately, I do not have the time to walk you through all of them. The ones in purple are the ones from list A, that is having been judged as having repro as the leading effect by registrants' work adenals. And the ones with hashtags are on both lists. I can just mention that 4 of these actually all already are on the authorization list. So in effect, we have 23 substances to look further into. A majority of these are recognized as SVHCs. Several of them are undergoing dossier evaluations, and some of these you might see are used as biocides or plant protection products. And in that subcategory, some have been non-renewed for those applications within the European Union. But if I understand it correctly, they might still be manufactured within the European Union, but not used as biocides or plant protection products. So let me summarize. Across the different lists that we looked at, the protective aims were differently phrased, but no one explicitly excludes reprotox. The REACH registrants' work adenals cover the largest number of repro substances, yet only 40%. But we did not investigate reasons for not being covered. So the repro classification is a reason for phasing out and substituting substances. So it could very well be that the low coverage is because we actually don't use them. And I've shown that previously for substances in general, but also here for the subset of repro classified substances, work adenals could be orders of magnitude higher or lower than OELs for the same substance. I have to say that based on current coverage and levels, the EU OELs listed in Annex 3 of CMRD are not forerunners, but that is a bit unfair of me because reproductive toxicants were added very recently to this directive, and it might not be the purpose of the regulation to be a forerunner, more to cover the substances of major concern and leveling the playing field, perhaps. And also, there are additional exposure reduction obligations under CMRD, especially for non-threshold substances, and that adds more protection than OELs in general. And also, as I've already mentioned, reprotox is not necessarily the effect occurring at the lowest exposure, according to the knowledge that we have, or the knowledge that is reviewed in these OEL documents. So the main concern, based on our findings, would be the low coverage. And there are many ways to think about prioritization for new OEL derivation. Let's focus on the bottom part of the slide for now. So a lack of OEL can mean lack of regulatory relevance or use. I think it's important that we consider actual workplace exposure and use conditions rather than tonnage in prioritizing. I have not been able to do that for time reasons, but my recommendation would be to start from this list of 23 shortlisted substances and map uses and what is known about occupational exposure for these to see if there's any substances that are important to address from an OEL perspective. Moving to the top bullet point of the slide, I'd also like to highlight that we didn't study literature coverage for repro in the scientific documentations, and that would actually be very interesting for a more in-depth study of their protectiveness. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Here are the references to some of the works that I've been leaning on in this presentation. Yeah, cheers.
Thank you very much, Linda, for this very nice presentation of your work. Super interesting to see, also food for a lot of thought. Hope to see you again in the near future, and let's keep in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.